Welcome everyone to day 3 of Webinar Week. We're happy that you joined us today, and over the past 2 days we have hosted 2 live webinars and released 9 new on-demand webinars. These presentations will be available all week. You can find them online at webinarweek.live. If you tune into all 4 live webinars this week, you will be entered into our grand prize drawing this Friday. One lucky attendee will win an all-expense-paid trip to the MD Expo Tampa this November 8th and 9th at the Tampa Marriott Water Street. We are currently accepting call for presenters for this conference, so if you're participating today and you're interested in submitting a presentation, please go to mdexposhow.com, look for the call for presenters option, fill out your submission, and our events team will contact you soon. I do want to point out to everyone in your handout section on the webinar dashboard, we have uploaded a PDF that's available for download. This is the pre-show planner for the 3 upcoming HTM mixers, the first being this August in Colorado. Then in October we'll be in Wisconsin, and December we'll be in Southern California. The first mixer in August is August 19th and 20th at the Omni Interlaken Hotel in Denver, Colorado. You can register to join the other 100 attendees that are planning to be there at htmmixer.com. All right, let's get started with today's webinar. The presentation is titled A Collaborative Approach to Downtime Planning for Critical Medical Device Systems. We're excited to have Izabella Gieras, Director of Clinical Technology at Huntington Hospital. She will speak to the collaborative approach within a multidisciplinary team that needs to be involved in downtime planning. Izabella, you may begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you, Jamie. And again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Looks like this is day 3, so hopefully everything is going well. And it looks like there is a lot of wonderful material ahead as part of this webinar series. So again, thank you everyone for joining us this morning or this afternoon, wherever you may be across the country. And with that, I'll go ahead and get started. As Jamie indicated, the title of the presentation today is The Collaborative Approach to Downtime Planning for Critical Medical Devices. Systems, devices will encompass all of this. So I'll go ahead and transition through the slides. So just a quick overview of the presentation that we will have, hitting some of the main points. Obviously, we know that all devices, systems experience some type of a downtime, whether it's planned or unplanned. We obviously wish for everything to be planned, but unfortunately that doesn't happen all the time. So we want to make sure that we are always ready for the unplanned downtime, as much as we can, of course. Downtimes can range from just a one single device, which we still have some impacting a single department, but often, and of course that always happens at 2 o'clock in the morning on the weekend, that it affects multiple systems that could obviously take the whole or parts of the hospital, and often if you're a multi-hospital system, can also range across different campuses. Downtime planning, obviously, if done appropriately, can provide you the support that is needed to make sure that not just as a department within clinical technology, biomed, or IT, you respond to that effectively, but also as an organization, you want to make sure that you have an appropriate response that minimizes any type of disruption. One of the main things, and we will talk about, of course, in more details, will be ensuring that planning incorporates communication plans. We want to make sure that we also have up-to-date and appropriate and practical policies and procedures, and also go through appropriate change management. And last but not least, some of the things that I will touch on, which I'm sure many of you can attest to, that will be the collaborative approach within a multidisciplinary team. Here at Huntington Hospital, the clinical technology department reports to the CIO, so we have the opportunity to work very closely across different departments within the IT division, but at the same time work very closely, of course, with the clinical, non-clinical, other support teams. Obviously, anybody that needs to be part of appropriate planning when it comes to these type of downtimes. So just a quick slide for those of you that may not know where Huntington Hospital is. We are located just outside of Los Angeles, here in sunny California. I put a slide out there of our Rose Parade, which happens every year on January 1st. Unfortunately, from what we're hearing with everything that's going on with COVID, the 2021 parade is not going to happen. So that is very sad news here, especially for Pasadena, as this is something that we look forward to every year. So hopefully we'll be able to resume in 2022. So just a quick slide. I won't go into too many details because I want to get into the meat of the presentation. In terms of Huntington Hospital by numbers, some of the things in terms of us being a level 2 trauma center, 619 licensed beds, bariatric stroke center. We have 18 operating rooms, 3 Da Vinci robotic systems, cath labs, over 6,500 plus people that's or staff here at the hospital, over 300 different applications, over 4,000, close to 5,000 now, end user computing devices. And between clinical technology and IT, as I mentioned, we work together as one division. Reporting up to the CIO, we have actually a little bit over the 110 members right now. Quickly within the clinical technology department, as you can see from the visual, we have myself as the director of the department. We have an administrative assistant. We have added a clinical systems engineer 3 years ago, which is something that I have enjoyed for the last few years and very much needed here in this department to help us with a lot of these downtimes. Actually, when you think about it, that's an appropriate role for this. And also from a medical device integration standpoint of view, again, the device vulnerabilities that we're hearing about that can also certainly lead to a lot of unplanned downtime. That particular role has added or has been a great asset to our department. We also have a project coordinator, which helps with a lot of day-to-day activities, as well as a lot of our projects, mostly focusing on our equipment evaluations, incident investigations, and so on. And then last but not least, we have 7 biomedical engineering technicians who are, again, kind of our foundation of the department and work obviously very closely with each other as well as with our IT counterparts. So let's start with a little bit of background. As you can see from this picture, and I know there are different variations of this picture that I'm sure you have seen across the internet and other venues. But as you can see, the clinical technology is very pervasive and growing. There's a multitude of different type of medical devices that has infiltrated the healthcare system. And of course, with any of these devices, whether they're single devices, interconnected, integrated, multi-system devices, can lead to some potential failures. As much as we want to make sure that they're as effective, efficient, and reliable, there is always that potential for some of these devices to go down. Some of those devices go down because we plan for them to go down, whether it's for software, hardware, or some other type of updates that need to be done. Other times it happens and it's unplanned, and we obviously want to make sure that, especially if they are critical devices, we plan for that appropriately, which is what we're here today. Again, a little bit of an extension of the previous slide. As I've mentioned, again, this will be focusing on a lot of the more critical devices, but obviously any type of planning can apply to any type of technologies. But as the technologies have progressed, you can probably attest to the fact that we have less and less of these single devices working by themselves on their own without any type of connections, whether it's, again, to another type of a device, another system, or EMR. As much of that technology has evolved over the years. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depends how you look at it. I think it's a wonderful progression, but at the same time, it does come with a lot of considerations that we need to make sure that we are able to support these systems, like I said, to continue to stay reliable and effective for our end users and, of course, patients. So planned downtime. The definition is pretty intuitive in terms of the period of time during which clinical operations or workflow are restricted in order to implement upgrades, repairs, and other changes to the technology and its environment. So obviously these are hopefully thought out planned downtimes. I mean, they can range from just an hour or even less to sometimes a full day or longer, depending on what the planned downtime is. Sometimes it's just a quick software upgrade, and sometimes you have to take a CT or an MRI down even when we do our planned preventive maintenance. It's still down, it's still inaccessible to the end users, but for most part, obviously, it's something that we're able to plan appropriately ahead of time, so we can plan that in between the operations and clinical needs. So obviously, with any of that, you want to still make sure you have appropriate communications ahead of time. I know many of our end users, when we do these type of planned downtimes on any scale, on any type of equipment, especially the critical equipment, they like to have as much lead time as possible, often even asking for a month or two, especially when we do some of our telemetry downtimes, when we know that we need to do some type of a hardware or a software upgrade. And a lot of it is because we also need clinical resources to support some of these downtimes. And a lot of them have their schedules done ahead of time, way ahead of time. So we want to make sure that we get into that schedule as soon as possible. So what we have done and learned our lessons from previous downtimes of such, that we plan this type of scheduling and resource planning as much ahead of that scheduled time as possible. Of course, unplanned downtime, as the name indicates, downtime that occurs as a result of an acute failure or of a device or, again, a system due to an internal or external cause, such as a software bug or a physical damage from use. Obviously, a lot of these things, we're very much reactive as opposed to proactive, because we can never anticipate any of these unplanned downtimes. But when that does happen, again, communication may not necessarily be ahead of time, but we want to make sure that we have as much communication as possible. And we have come up over the years with templates that we use for these type of communications, whether it's planned or unplanned, but you can easily convert into whatever the situation that may be at hand, and then send that out immediately as soon as you know what is going on. And obviously, similar communication template can continue to be used as you provide upgrades on the downtime. Of course, there are different causes of downtime. We've alluded to some of them already, and I know much of that is not rocket science or not unfamiliar to you already in terms of hardware components that need to be upgraded, firmware, device drivers, overall operating systems, and of course software in many of our devices. Some of the things that we're going through in the next month or so, looking at upgrading switches, APCs, and a lot of other hardware in our IDF closet. So that particular downtime, and I will talk a little bit about that towards the end, is very much involves downtime, which includes a lot of our clinical staff, and we are working very diligently to come up with appropriate resource planning for that, especially with everything that is going on with COVID, as some of the floors impacted by this are our COVID floors. So as you can imagine, that's another component or level of complexity that has been added to a lot of the downtime planning that in the past we haven't had to consider as much. Of course, accidental, intentional fire deletions, unskilled operation, especially if we have some type of a use error, something has happened, and of course, hopefully inadvertently, but needs to be repaired appropriately, but leads to downtime. And as I mentioned, a lot of that is within the IT clinical tech biomed systems that need to be repaired, replaced, or maintained, as I mentioned, with CT MRIs, planned downtime for a preventive maintenance, or any even routine upgrades that need to be done to some of the hardware and software on our patient monitoring equipment or alike. So, of course, the impact downtime can be classified into various components. Risk to the patient. So obviously we We want to make sure that obviously none of that stuff happens, but sometimes it does. So we obviously need to take that into consideration as a potential outcome and obviously have some means to be able to address that moving forward. And hopefully a lot of these can lead to lessons learned that can be downloaded through some type of a root cause analysis after the event happens. So lessons can be learned and applied to future planning. Sentinel events, near misses, delayed treatments, a lot of them from a risk perspective, especially to the patient safety, certainly need to be considered and taken into, obviously, like I said, consideration when you are planning your downtime, especially if it's a planned downtime. We cannot forget about our employees because with any downtimes, there's potentially some near misses and injuries that can happen to the individuals, especially those operating the equipment. Those are usually extreme, but certainly possible. Productivity. So what employees are affected by this, administrators, obviously at the command center, we usually establish a command center, especially if it's a more involved and longer type of a downtime. We do open our command center, and that stays open from when we go down to when we go up again, and everything has been validated and it's considered to be a successful implementation. We obviously want to consider the employees that will not be working during the time of the downtime. Is there something that can be done to be able to ensure their productivity, whether they get transferred to another department, or is there a place for them to assist during that downtime? Obviously, financial losses that can be during planned, and a lot of it obviously can certainly be during unplanned downtime, but thinking about any type of cost that's related to labor, materials that are needed. For example, for us, when we do some of the downtime planning related to our patient monitoring and some of that's actually happening in the next month or so that I alluded to, we will need some extra staffing that we normally don't have to have on that particular day or actually particular week because our implementation will span over 4 to 5 days. We will need to account for these individuals to come in, and obviously there will be associated labor costs with that. Obviously, potential revenue if you're losing some type of a system, especially on the imaging side, that is one of your main revenue generating technologies, and here you are down for even 4 to 8 hours, and you potentially lost 4 to 5 patients that would have been scheduled otherwise and need to be rescheduled, and hopefully that can happen eventually, sooner rather than later. Billing, legal, potentially, hopefully that's the worst case scenario, and credit rating from an aspect, especially if it's something that's more of a major downtime, and that may impact just an overall, reputation from the credit rating perspective, but that certainly can lead to a financial impact, which is what leads to the damaged reputation piece of it from a customer and supplier's perspective. Obviously, these are what I would say probably more on the extreme side, but something that we don't always think about as we do our planning and hopefully avoidance of unscheduled downtime. And those are the things that we certainly want to consider because those are the things that certainly can be impacted. Other things just in general, as I mentioned, from a labor perspective, whether we hire temporary labor or bring in extra staffing, there is obviously that consideration. Sometimes rental of equipment. We have done that with a lot of, again, I keep on going back to the patient monitoring because that's an easy one since there is always some type of a downtime, whether it's scheduled or unscheduled with that. And oftentimes, especially on telemetry floors, we have in the past rented some portable patient monitors to be able to support the downtime. Overtime cost, whether it's on the biomed IT or the clinical side, and of course, travel expenses, especially if you do have vendors coming in, and that does happen when you need vendor participation on site. For most part, what we've tried to do is to do as much remote vendor participation as possible, but there are many times, of course, that you still need them to come on site, and there are, of course, charges associated with that. So as I mentioned earlier on, a lot of this downtime planning takes a village. It's a multidisciplinary process. It's not something that clinical technology or biomed departments can certainly do on their own anymore. I mean, we can, but it's certainly something that is valuable to include other subject matter experts to be able to develop a plan that, like I said, is sound and also covers, all the different possibilities that we're obviously hoping to avoid or at least take into consideration. So obviously the healthcare technology management, information technology, information security, we sometimes forget about that group, and it's something that's obviously essential, especially as we get into the more multi-system, interconnected, integrated equipment, and there may be some potential for security breaches with the downtimes. Again, planned or unplanned, doesn't matter at that point. You still need to make sure that you take that into consideration and have appropriate security measures in place. Of course, our clinical end users are absolutely essential in planning. Materials management purchasing, they're also a key component, but sometimes forgotten. We want to make sure that we consider them, especially if we do rent or need to purchase some additional materials, equipment for anything that may need to stay on hand if we do have anticipated downtime. One of the things that we have learned, and that certainly can be a separate topic for discussion, is during the COVID planning and making sure that we are readily available for any future surges or even any other type of pandemic, epidemic episodes, that we have what is needed from just purely medical equipment standpoint of view to be able to support the needs that we've had here at Huntington Hospital that required, especially some of the key things. Obviously, you guys heard about the ventilators. For us, it was also patient monitors and other devices that sometimes you wouldn't even think about in the past, such as thermometers, which at some point or another, it was so hard to source those. So things like that, making sure that you have some of the basic stuff available for these type of downtimes, or in this case, more involved type of pandemic downtimes. Vendors, of course, need to be very much involved, and others. There are, I'm sure, a lot of other stakeholders that would be needed on ad hoc basis, depending, again, on the type of a downtime that you have. So these are just high-level statistics from the ECRI Institute between 2018 and 2020. As you know, every year ECRI Institute releases their top 10 hazards for medical equipment or medical technologies. These are just some. You can read through the slide that can certainly down the road provide or lead to some type of unscheduled downtime, but some of it is also scheduled, so it will be important as you do this type of planning to consider this. Of course, the cybersecurity side of it that we talked about from a medical device or information security side of it. Alarms is a big thing for us here at Huntington as well, and we've put some things on hold during COVID, but are starting to refresh a lot of our work that we have done to make sure that we obviously appropriately address any type of alarm management, especially if there is some downtimes related to that. We want to make sure that we have appropriate safety measures in place to be able to support anything that may be a failure of the devices on that system, especially from a telemetry standpoint of view. We are in the process of developing a centralized telemetry war room or cockpit, as it may be called in different institutions. And that process has been very laborious, but much needed, and something that we have been working tirelessly within clinical technology, IT, and our end users to make sure that we plan for any type of downtimes by making sure that we implement the appropriate technologies in place to hopefully minimize any of these potential downtimes. So this is just something we can leave for the end, but just something to consider. I know we'll have a Q&A session coming up towards the end of this webinar. Just something for you to think about. What is the longest unscheduled downtime you had in the last 6 months? What type of unscheduled downtime you had in the last 6 months? It would be interesting if you're willing to share some of that with the audience of what that was. We can leave that towards the end. Just some other, some of it is not one of the latest statistics. This is from a few years ago, but this was done through the Elsevier Publishing. Contingency planning for electronic health record-based care continuity, a survey that was conducted that talked about 70%, which was of the 50 institutions, had at least one unplanned downtime greater than 8 hours, which is pretty lengthy from a clinical perspective in the last 3 years. 3 institutions reported that one or more patients were injured as a result of either a planned or an unplanned downtime. So just some interesting statistics. Like I said, it's not the latest and greatest, but definitely of interest. This is another one just to consider. It's, again, nothing of in terms of the latest that I have seen released, but this is a Sentinel event alert that came out in 2015 from Joint Commission. This is the issue 54 that talked about the safe use of health information technology. It's just a snapshot from that. Then the next slide just talks a little bit about some of the, I guess you could say, key messages in terms of using health technology, health information technology, but making sure that you create and make available and regularly review health, IT downtime, and reactivation policies, which hopefully everybody is aware of that and everybody is already on top of that. Sometimes we find policies that haven't been reviewed in years, and of course processes have changed, people have changed, even departments have moved around. So you want to make sure that you stay current on that, especially with a lot of contact information if it's included in that. Obviously, before going live with any type of an implementation or as appropriate after implementation, making sure that appropriate testing is done, including even downtime drills. I know it's something we don't really do as much as we should, but certainly something to think about, especially as some of the systems that are more delicate and more complex and certainly critical. You can practice some of that for any potential future downtimes. It's always good to have. And then, of course, metrics that can include help desk use, system uptime, downtime. One of the things that we have done, and we've learned a lot through COVID and looking at our analytics, so we've beefed up a lot of the analytics processes that we have and applications and so on as a result of that, making sure that we are able to gather as much data. It's almost like the before and after and see how things have changed, but definitely after the implementation or after downtime, what are some of the metrics that have been gathered and how can we use those metrics to be able to help us improve in future planning or future downtimes. So a little bit about the Huntington Hospital approach when it comes to downtime planning. So one of the things in terms of the recipe for success, and this is kind of rounding up a lot of the things that we've talked about, but in case I've missed something, I want to make sure that I cover it here. Good planning. Cannot stress that enough. I know we are so busy and there's so many things going on that sometimes it's hard to just allocate time to plan for an unscheduled downtime. I know we do quite a bit of planning, and hopefully you guys do too, when it comes to scheduled downtimes, but it's the unscheduled downtimes that we don't always take the time to look back and see what can we do. Even those downtime drills and things like that can help us prepare for the unscheduled times. Reasonable and practical policies and procedures. Like I said, we want to make sure that our policies are up to date. They're readily available, have appropriate contact information, because when it does come to unscheduled downtime at 2 o'clock in the morning, you want to make sure that you have all your handy contact information right there and available, so you know who you need to pull into a conference call, Everbridge conference call, which is what we have. Who do you need to designate certain functions to be able to do follow-ups and things like that. Even from a vendor perspective, have that contact information readily available in case you do need to call them in the middle of the night. Command center, as I mentioned, we do have a command center that we normally open up, especially if it impacts a multiple number of clinical floors. We usually open up a command center. We have a command center, a commander, incident commander that helps to manage the events, and then we assign specific roles depending, again, on what the downtime is to be able to manage that. This often happens when we have planned downtime, but certainly can be activated as needed with policies that we have in place on how to do that when you also have unscheduled downtime. When we had the peak of our COVID during the March, April, May timeframe, we had our command center open 24/7. So that was staffed with managers and directors, clinical and non-clinical. We were running shifts, like I said, around the clock to be able to support that in case there are some downtimes associated with COVID, since COVID itself was quite a bit of a downtime for us, as you can imagine, for you as well. The bridge conference calls, as I mentioned, we use Everbridge. So we do that for any type of technical issues and obviously any type of updates that need to be sent out to stakeholders. That's usually the best way of getting in touch with everybody and communicating on progress. Other than email, sometimes email is down too, so it's not always the best means of communicating. Downtime teams, we do form downtime teams that are in charge of specific type of downtimes, again, depending on the type of downtime that we have. And I've talked about the vendor contacts. That's very, very important to have that handy, especially for your key critical systems. And then the service level agreements, make sure that you have those in place, because often when you do call vendors, certain vendors will be asking for, I need to know what kind of arrangement you have for the equipment that's being maintained, if you do have some type of a contractual arrangement with them. Also, from your own internal perspective, what are the different service levels that you have in place in terms of who responds, which, within IT, within clinical technology, and at what point some of that needs to be escalated, whether it's to the manager, director, the CIO. Sometimes, of course, downtime also has to be escalated all the way to the CEO of the hospital. Okay. Moving on, of course, communication plans, and we've talked about that for planned and unplanned downtime. An absolute must, excuse me, an absolute must to have. It's something that we have come up with some templates, as I mentioned earlier on, so it's easier for us to send out communication, obviously just tailoring it to the specific type of downtime, but you want to make sure that you at least have some type of a template that you can copy and paste or use for send out. It made a tremendous difference for us than trying to even come up with a short email. With everything that's going on, that's probably the last thing that you want to do, is try and compose an email. Defining clinical and non-clinical roles, that hopefully is something that you already have in place, even for unscheduled downtime. But if not, that's something that I do suggest is done, and also put in some type of a policy or procedure for sure. Root cause analysis, I mentioned that earlier, especially if there is a risk to the patient or to the employee involved. Do some type of a root cause analysis after the event, especially if it's an unplanned event, to see what can be done, what can be learned, which kind of goes into the number 11, the post-event monitoring, lessons learned. You definitely want to do that after your unscheduled downtime, because there are always some good lessons learned that can be applied to even further improving your planning process for future downtimes. So from the communication plans perspective, a lot of that is, very much intuitive, and I'm sure you're familiar with this as well, but sometimes we forget about just the basic stuff. Obviously what systems will be down, when will the downtime begin, especially if you have a planned downtime, how long the system will be unavailable, why will the system be down. We obviously want to communicate that so everybody else knows what is going on, especially the peripheral departments that are impacted by this, and what changes are being made to the system, especially if there are some upgrades or updates. From a user perspective, we want to make sure that we hopefully have addressed that ahead of time, because we want to make sure that when everything has been upgraded, the users are ready to go. So that brings on even a different level of planning in terms of having the appropriate training and services done with the clinical end users, especially if there's is a clinical change to how they operate, how they use the equipment after the downtime. So downtime policies and procedures, as I mentioned, obviously making sure that clinical technology is included, IT, and then the other piece, as I mentioned, nursing within many of our policies. We have all three departments included, and then on ad hoc basis, we do have obviously some other departments as needed, but those three departments are key in any type of policy development, policy updates, changes, and things like that. And then obviously have to go through appropriate committees for these policies to be approved. We also have change management. Our change management, change control meetings take place weekly, and we have, since we've been under IT for quite some time now, have been more and more trying to get used to the different processes that they've had and some processes that have been tweaked. But more so than ever before, whenever we have software or hardware upgrades, we take that through the change management and have appropriate, again, work orders that are submitted or forms that are submitted actually through ServiceNow that are reviewed and approved within the change management or the change control committee. But anytime we do anything, we try to have that covered through that process. So we're able to have the appropriate documentation in place for the downtime that's taking place. Of course, this is now for planned downtime, and also have a record for us to know that it has followed the process and have an ability to reference any type of rollback plans or any other remediation plans that may need to take place if that particular upgrade does not take well. Obviously, there are the normal, and then there are also some emergency submissions that we have. Sometimes things need to happen relatively quickly, still planned as opposed to unplanned, but in a much, much shorter time frame. And we then follow what we call an emergency approval process, which, of course, it's much shorter because we need approval ASAP. And I've talked about the approval process already. We do have key individuals within the IT and clinical technology that are selected to be part of that approval process, and we need to have a certain number of individuals within that group approve it before the overall process is approved and proceeds to the change control meetings that happen weekly, as I mentioned before. So just a quick case study. This is something that talks about more of a planned downtime, and we do that now on a monthly basis, and this happens on our alarm management middleware and our EMR integration interface. We have done those sporadically in the past, and probably 2-3 years ago now, I would say, we have collaborated very closely with IT and especially information security to make sure that we establish a process and a regular patching of these devices. So this is something that we also had to coordinate very closely with the clinical staff, because when this happens on a monthly basis, we are not able to receive alarms that we normally receive on our end user device, which is a phone, and the clinical staff relies on that heavily. So when that happens, we put together monitor watchers in front of our central stations on the floor itself to be able to receive the alarms and communicate with the clinical staff. I did talk a little bit about us establishing a centralized telemetry room that's in the works and will help tremendously with a lot of these downtimes. But for now, we need to make sure that this is done appropriately, because we absolutely do not want to anticipate any type of issues when we are down for about an hour or two, although it has gotten to be a much more seamless process now that we've been doing this for almost 3 years. But certainly impacts a lot of our telemetry, which we have the 222 beds, So we want to make sure that everything is planned appropriately with appropriate communication, appropriate scheduling of the necessary staff to watch the alarms and communicate appropriately. So again, a lot of work that went in to establish that process. And then obviously a lot of that was in partnership with, as you can see through the slides, the clinical staff, our department, information technology, information security, and then vendors get involved on an as needed basis. This is just a quick slide, and it's busy, but we can certainly talk about that, or if anybody wants to contact me after, I'll be happy to share that. But we have come up with templates for what the downtime will look like from our alarm EMR standpoint of view, and then how it impacts all the different floors, and also in some other subsequent documentation defined in terms of the roles. What does clinical technology do? What does IT do? And then, of course, what do the clinical end users do on the floors during this downtime? We also, of course, as we've talked about labor resources, we needed to make sure that we have the appropriate staff in place for these. Since this is a repetitive monthly event, it has gotten a lot easier to plan for this. But it's a quick table that talks, again, the role piece of it that I mentioned, but also know what on the clinical side needs to be allocated in terms of hours. What does that look like on the IT side? What does that look like on the clinical technology side? And of course, clinical managers need to be involved, especially in some of the planning. A lot of that planning took place already, and now again we just repeat that process that we have already established. But it was a bit of a uphill battle here and there to try and put everything together, because it is an impact, and nobody wants to be down with their system for an extended period of time. But again, like I said, over time, and since we've been doing this for almost 3 years now, the whole process is very seamless, and we were able to actually reduce it from about 2 hours to just less than an hour from the time we go down, patch the system, validate, and then the last piece that we do is we do walk around the different telemetry floors and do the alarm validation to make sure that everything has returned back to normal. So that has, like I said, become a lot more efficient now. So in summary, I cannot stress this enough, and I'm sure you have now heard that numerous times throughout the presentation, that partnerships is the key. Don't forget about the people out there on the floor, especially the end users. I know sometimes, we forget about somebody, but hopefully somebody will remind us of that somebody that has been forgotten, and we communicate to them appropriately, because it is essential for them to be prepared, as any type of slips in that preparation process, as I mentioned in previous slides, potentially could have a safety type of risk impact on the patient or the caregiver. So that's where the planning component comes in and needs to be done, not just, again, for the planned downtime, but also for the unplanned downtime, as much as we can. I know we cannot anticipate every type of a scenario for unplanned downtime, and you can certainly never anticipate when it will go down, but you should at least be prepared as much as possible based on what we've talked about to be able to respond to that. And then, of course, be flexible, because a lot of things change. Often you have to change things last minute. So you want to make sure that you have that flexibility and be nimble about the processes and procedures that you have implemented, because sometimes they have to be changed on the fly, and you need to make those decisions quickly to be able to accommodate to whatever you're being faced with, especially as part of a unplanned downtime. So with that, just wanted to thank you for your attention and participation. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Jamie.
Awesome, Izabella. Thank you so much. During your presentation, attendees did submit questions that we're going to read through, as many as time will allow. But I did want to remind everyone you can continue to submit your questions by using the question feature on your dashboard. Any that we can't get through in the 60-minute time period, I'll send over to Izabella's attention, so she's welcome to follow up offline. But Izabella, the first question, What plan do you recommend for equipment PMs on equipment used in COVID patient rooms? The patient turnover is rapid and overworked staff seem to be bothered by the request to swap out equipment.
Yeah, that's a very, very valid question, and I knew it was going to come up with everything that's going on. Let me respond to it in this way. We are actually working through a downtime planning right now that will happen at the end of August, and I think I alluded to that earlier on in my presentation. That talk to the some of the hardware components that we need to replace in our IDF closets that impact, obviously, the clinical operations on the clinical floor itself. And those floors that are being impacted that we are mostly concerned about are our telemetry floors. And some of those floors, not all of them, but some of those floors are COVID floors. So and actually I do have a meeting coming up this week that we're trying to do is, believe it or not, and this is crazy and I don't even know if this will work, but we're trying to come up with a remote video monitoring where in the past, and the type of equipment that we have today for telemetry actually also has a waveform, which is our Philips MX450s today. So for those of you that are familiar with those devices will know what I'm talking about. In the past, when we had downtimes, we actually assigned nurses in the room to watch the waveforms because we lost visibility of that on our central station. So that was our only way to do that. Now, obviously, under the COVID circumstances, this is not ideal for the nurse to be just sitting there in the room for half an hour to, even potentially 60 minutes doing that, of course, fully equipped with, PPE equipment and so on. So we're trying to do is install actually remote cameras that will be looking over the telemetry boxes and be able to have that visibility outside at the central station and have a nurse sitting there. So obviously, if there is an alarm or something happens, or based on the waveform interpretation, something goes wrong, then they will obviously need to go into the patient's room. But our hope is to be able to set up these remote stations to be able to view into the patient's room. Since we are losing the visibility on the central station, we're kind of creating a semi-central station, viewing station for that particular downtime. So we're trying to see if this is going to work. This is probably one of the more extreme situations, just because it's an extended downtime, even though it's planned downtime, but still under the circumstances does require quite a bit of kind of out-of-the-box planning. When it comes to some of the other just kind of swapping out equipment, I don't know if the question alluded to more just going into the patient's room and maybe swapping out a patient monitor because the patient monitor went down. That is a tricky situation. We have had to deal with that as well, and a lot of it, unfortunately, is just planning with the clinical staff to be able to do that. Sometimes we have provided portable patient monitors where, we're obviously in extreme cases. I know it's not always ideal to be able to do that, but that kind of takes away the need to be in the patient room swapping out the bedside monitor. Well, you can provide them with something portable, at least for the time being, until there is a better, not that there is ever a better time, but a more, accessible time to get in and actually do that repair, which could take an hour or two, which you don't always have the luxury to do that, especially with the patients there.
Another attendee says planning downtime of dialysis and acute dialysis hospital setting is very difficult due to rapidly changing patient census, increased isolation, treatments, and it really puts a crunch on the equipment availability. Do you have any advice in this section?
Good question. Unfortunately, we do not deal as much with dialysis here as I would love to. Our dialysis program is outsourced. The extent of our dialysis involvement is we do work closely with the vendor to make sure that there is appropriate documentation in place for Joint Commission, CMS, and other regulatory body purposes from that perspective. But in terms of downtime planning, I do not have, unfortunately, and I apologize, firsthand experience of how I can help you. I can certainly take that question back and see if there is anything that I can think of, or even consult with some of other colleagues to be able to respond to that offline.
Wonderful. I'll be sure to send over the information for you, Izabella. And I have enjoyed this presentation, as I know the attendees have as well. I do want to remind everyone before we close out today that today's webinar is eligible for 1 CE credit from the ACI. Within an hour's time, you're going to receive an email with today's post-webinar survey. You must complete the survey to receive the certificate, but if you have any questions throughout the process, you're always welcome to reach us by emailing webinars@mdpublishing.com. Don't forget that tomorrow is the last day of webinar week. Please join us for one more live webinar kicking off at 12 p.m. Eastern. The title of that is Maintaining an In-House Medical Device Cybersecurity Program. If you haven't done so already, you can register for this webinar by visiting webinarweek.live. Hope you make the rest of your day fantastic. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Okay. Thank you, Jamie, again, and thank you, everybody. And if there are any additional questions that you receive, please feel free to send them my way.